Hello, hello. My name is Vincent David. I'm with the International Communist League and the newspaper Spartacist, and I want to present to you our brand new issue of Spartacist, number 69, which is just about to come out as I'm talking to you. Obviously, this isn't the final; it is being finished as I'm speaking. As you can see, front page is dedicated to Palestine, Marxists and Palestine, 100 years of failures, lessons, and prospects. And this issue also includes multiple articles on France, on Argentina, on India, on China, and much more. And I'll try to briefly present each one of them to you here. Before getting on the front page, I want to start actually with our editorial, which is called Tough Times Ahead. And as the title says, this editorial sorts of takes stocks of the world situation, sorts of present our understanding of things, and predict that we are expecting a period of the growth of right wing reaction, increased attacks on the workers' movement and the oppressed in the immediate period, and that the role of Marxists must be to prepare, organize our struggle with this understanding. And we based ourselves by looking at the wave of recent strikes and social upheavals that sort of shook the world in the year 2022 2023, after the pandemic, the outbreak of the Ukraine war, and how this wave has sorts of receded. And we also look at the Palestinian struggle, the main area of struggle in the last months, and which is facing an impasse, really. And this is all in the context where the economic situation has seen a relative stabilization, but more crucially, where the working class nowhere in the world has been able to really impose itself as a defining force, really push to the fore its interests, which has ceded the ground to the growth of the far right, in which many workers and even wings of the ruling class are increasingly putting their fate into. And this sort of difficult situation for the working class happens on the eve of major shocks. So it is reasonable to expect an economic crisis in the near future, or at least a slowdown, which will only increase the various polarization we're seeing. Ukraine is being defeated on the battlefield, and a Russian victory is increasingly the most likely outcome. And as well as China, it's facing a turning point. Its growth model is facing a wall. And the growth of China had been one of the main engine of the world economy for a while. So whatever happened in China, in Ukraine, or the economic situation, or broader conflict in the Middle East, as we're sort of seeing constantly, at least the risk of, all these developments will have profound impact on the whole economic, political, social arrangement in the world. And as things stand, unless the working class can really enter as a force and push its interests forward, we believe that these developments will most likely benefit the political right, at least in their immediate consequences. And so our assessment is really different than what you hear from other left groups who believe that this period of turmoil necessarily means the growth of the left, that the doors are open for the socialist movement, and that what's posed are revolutionary offensive, and that this is a good period for us. And all of this is profoundly disorienting for the socialist movement, actually, because no, things are not going well for our camp, and they will probably go even worse before it gets better. And so this is important, not because we're pessimistic, that's not pessimism, but it's important to orient the socialists in their task with a correct understanding of what are the trends and what is the state of the world we live in. And that it's simply delusional to believe, as some on the left do, that current trends are favoring the communist movement. No, there isn't. So that means, as we explained, all of this is developed in the editorial in a much better manner. But what it means is that the task posed for socialists is to prepare defensive struggles, to pursue debates among other left organizations in the socialist movement about the state of the world, and struggles with organizations that are in crisis, who don't know what to do in the current situation. As well, what is key is to continue implementation in the working class, and connects and seek to push forward its struggle so that it can enter the scene as a force, and crucially, all of this to advance the fight against the leaders of the working class, which have really led the proletariat and led our class in this disastrous situation, usually by tying the workers' movement to a wing of the bourgeoisie and paving the way for the far right in this way. So, the front page article of this issue, as I said, Marxist and Palestine 100 Years of Failures, Lessons, and Prospects, is really an article detailing the history of the Palestinian liberation struggle, with obviously, as the title says, a focus on the Marxist movement. There's a massive denial in the left on two levels. First, many leftists believe that the record of the Marxist movement regarding Palestine is good. And no, it isn't actually. The history of the Marxist movement is characterized by a succession of capitulations to Arab nationalism, but also to Zionism throughout its century long existence and more. And it has never been able to offer really a revolutionary strategy for Palestine throughout the last century, with the exception really of the early Comintern. But that lasted only a few years, as we explained. And as a result, the Marxist movement has never played a decisive role in the Palestinian struggle. It has always liquidated its banner into other forces. And then the second sense of denial in the left is about the current struggle going on. Gaza is being bombed, a new Nakba is unfolding, um, and attacks on the West Bank are increasing, and the aims of the Zionist movement are actually progressing. That is to expel the Palestinians from the river to the sea. That's what the Zionists want. And that's what we're seeing, at least in an accelerated fashion. And yet, many leftists believe that the struggle is going well. Some chant that Palestine is almost free and that this is a great anti-imperialist movement. But the movement is at an impasse, including in the West. It hasn't been able to really stop the genocide or stop the support of Western powers to it. Same thing in the global South. And so it's important to state the truth. The Marxist movement has a terrible record on Palestine, and the movement right now is at an impasse, and it is plagued by the same problems which have plagued the Marxist movement for 100 years. This constant capitulation to either nationalism, cheering the current leadership of the Palestinian struggle, or else to Zionism, and capitulating to the whether it is through a two-state solution, whether it is through the Green Line, whether it is through capitulating to the liberal leaders who are leading the demonstration, particularly in the West, who are often, left or soft Zionists. And so the article really goes through the history of the Marxist movement from the early Palestine Communist Party, who really constantly affiliated and capitulated to either Zionism or nationalism, up to Stalin and how Stalin supported the Nakba in an incredible and terrible betrayal. And we also spent quite a lot of time dealing with the Trotskyists in Palestine and how them too were constantly balancing between centrism or capitulation to Zionism, and how the Trotskyist movement, when the Nakba came, the 1948 war, refused to side with the Arab forces against Israel, who was waging an expansionist war to create the Zionist state. And we also, in this framework, spend also sometimes to criticize our own history, because we shared some of these positions and we're trying to break from them through this article. And so today the left is caught really in the same problems that have plagued the Marxist movement for 100 years. Zionism, left nationalism, incapable of putting forward an independent path of struggle for Palestinian liberation from a communist revolutionary standpoint. And that's what our article seeks to lay the basis for by taking stocks of these lessons. Another important piece of this issue, not imperialist, not capitalist, the class nature of China. So the left is completely disoriented about China, and most of them understand nothing of its functioning and its dynamic. And in large part, that's because they either cheer on the Chinese Communist Party, that some of them do, but most of them believe that China is capitalist or imperialist. And it's against this second trend that we really focused our article. And first, we lay out how the conception that China is an imperialist power is really a revision of Lenin's theory of imperialism. And concretely, it's a denial of the fact that it is the US that dominates the world, and that the struggle of Marxists worldwide is not against Chinese supposed imperialism, which is just basically a watchword created in the West to cover the fact that it is the US that dominates the world. They are the number one imperialist powers. And so we attack that conception, and then the article goes on in a longer section, really into the internal functioning of China and trying to debunk all the arguments that people are using to say that it is capitalist, and actually making a case that no, China retains the central features of a what we Trotskyists call a deformed worker state, a state issued out of a revolution, but which is saddled by a Stalinist bureaucracy. And crucially, we developed the argument as to how every left group that believes China is capitalist is revising the basic Marxist theory of the state as laid out by Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Because their thinking is that in 1949, the Chinese Revolution created a worker state, and then somehow, through a process of a few years or sometimes a few decades, this worker state sort of mutated peacefully without any sort of sharp break into a capitalist state, which is just not a Marxist view of the state. And through these polemics against various left tendencies, we reaffirm the fundamental task of Marxists in China, which is to defend China against forces of imperialism and counter-revolution, but also to fight for a political revolution against the Stalinist regime, which is really in every single one of its action endangering the survival of the People's Republic of China. Another key article is on India, the fight against Modi, what next? And this is really a substantial piece uh, about the some of the key questions for revolution in India. Um, so the peg of it is that the recent elections in India, Modi lost its majority and was forced into a coalition and did less good than what was predicted. And that was presented by the left in India, but also worldwide, as a great victory for democracy against fascism and Hindu nationalism. But what really our article seeks to argue is that Modi's loss has nothing to do with Congress, which is the main oppositional party and the leader of this sort of coalition also called India. Um, so that the victory of Modi has nothing to do with the success of the Congress-led coalition, but rather is due to the failure of the BJP to fulfill the development needs of India. And that Congress, which represents another wing of the bourgeoisie, has no more answer to India's problems, which are rooted in private property and foreign domination, which of course the bourgeoisie cannot challenge. And our fundamental thesis is that uh, the left clinging to Congress, because Congress is a coalition that includes Hindu chauvinists all the way to all the communist parties in India, and there are many, and how the left, latching itself to this coalition is really the fundamental obstacle to fight against Hindu nationalism and really constitute the central obstacle to building a revolutionary party and fight for revolution in India. And what's really interesting about this article is that it really lays out a picture about the history of the country since independence and lays out in a materialist fashion why the bourgeoisie is unable to resolve any sort of the key task of development in India. And in particular, the article goes quite in depth in describing how Congress paved the way for Modi's BJP and Hindu nationalism, in particular with its liberal ideology, its secularism, its use of reservation and positive discrimination as a way to seek to pit different minority group against each other to shore up for its incapacity to really lift the country economically, and all sorts of divisions which have fuel Hindu nationalism. The article is written by our comrade Mansa Kaur, who I'm sure would have done a much better job at summarizing its main thesis than I did. And it is, I believe, an excellent piece for those who want to understand the fundamental question for revolution in this very, very important country. Another piece that might be a bit controversial among certain quarters. Trotskyists in Argentina, hot air, and sectarianism. So in the last months, we made several trips to Argentina, and which gave us a small sense of the country, and also enabled us to see the massive Trotskyist left in Argentina in action. And as the title say, our assessment is quite critical. So the country, Argentina, is in crisis. Javier Milei, this libertarian, far-right, pro-imperialist politician, came to power last year with an agenda to really crush the working class. And Millet is really facing leaders of the labor movement who are refusing to mount any sort of serious struggle against it. And they're completely selling out the struggle, essentially. And the forces of the FITU, which is the sort of Trotskyist broad coalition, which include different parties, are also pursuing a disastrous course. As the article sort of detail, they criticize the CGT bureaucracy, they speak of socialism, but what they refuse to do is to fundamentally confront the leaders of the union bureaucracy in Argentina and put forward a counterpose strategy of struggle. And they're approaching the fight against Milei not from the standpoint of what is the fundamental task, that is to break the workers from the trade union leaders who are Peronists and really win them to a counterpose strategy. But rather, they are viewing the struggle as this constant rising tide. Everything is going well. There are strikes, and they view their role trying to push a bit these struggles and push to the left the fundamentally bankrupt strategy of the union leaders. And they sort of has this conception that like the attacks of Millet will inevitably push the masses into struggle, and we sort of have to wait for this tide instead of seeking to establish themselves as a counterpose pole and provide an avenue of struggle for the working masses. The absence of it being one of the central reasons why there hasn't been more pressure. And the sectarian part, as our article lays out, is that the left, in refusing to confront fundamentally the leaders of the trade unions, are constantly trying to avoid this head-on confrontation. So rather than focusing really on the trade unions, they sort of tend to avoid these area of work by building base committee or assemblies or different organizational means of going around the question of the trade union bureaucracy. And this is graphically exposed, for example, on May Day, and we described that event where most of the left boycotted the massive union demonstration and organized its own little event. So this article is really, really shows how the Trotskyist left is leaving the leadership of the struggle in the hands of the Peronist trade union bureaucracy, which will lead it to disaster. And it's sort of a signal of alarm for the Trotskyist left in Argentina and beyond. Other article, France. The Popular Front paves the way for Le Pen. So that's another place where there's been a lot of triumphalism in the left. The election of the victory of the New Popular Front in the legislative election was sort of celebrated as we blocked the right. But actually, what our article explained is that no, it isn't a victory. The New Popular Front is a class collaborationist alliance which unites the far left all the way to the worst representative of French imperialism. And what our article explained is that what we're seeing with it is a repetition of the Republican Front. That is the creation of broad class collaborationist alliances brokered in the name of blocking the far right, and who basically for 40 years have only served to prop up governments who attack the working class and in turn fuel the growth of the far right. And the article of our French comrade explained this dynamics and how the support of the entire French left to the New Popular Front was a total betrayal and is actually the central obstacle to build a working class pole against the far right and against also those who are paving the way for it and those liberal politicians. And we've particularly focused on organizations like Lutte Ouvrière, the NPAR, and Révolution Permanente. If you follow the French left, you'll know them. Because these groups were more to the left, initially opposed the Popular Front, but then completely capitulated to it in the second turn, leaving basically our French comrades as the only group who had a consistent position of opposing the Popular Front. And this is not good. It bodes really bad for the working class, because a government of the NFP, or a coalition of the Popular Front with element of the center, or just the current chaos of non-government, will only help and fuel the far right, who are gearing themselves for the 2027 presidency. Um, Lastly, there's another piece called Marxist Principles and Electoral Tactics Revisited. And this piece is a bit different than the other. It's a bit more theoretical. So the peg of the article is that it corrects a position that we had taken in the 2000, which basically said that it was unprincipled for Marxists to run in elections for executive posts like president, mayor, like that. If you run for these posts, you're fueling illusion in the capitalist state. And so we reject this position as totally sectarian. I mean, it's a capitulation to the reformists who do run for these posts, and also part of a sterile method of politics, which was not based on how do we break the illusions of the working class and reformism and bourgeois democracy, but rather how do we find some sort of talisman to avoid opportunism. So, but more than just correcting our position, um, the article also goes a bit broader and tries to lay out how revolutionaries can use elections to really advance our cause and build a revolutionary party, and how can we use tactics in a communist way to break the illusions of the working class. And so these are the various main pieces. Every piece has usually smaller articles, which I won't get into. So the purpose of this entire issue of Spartacist is a bit of a wake-up call for the left. And while we were writing it, we sort of viewed it as we're sort of slaughtering many of the sacred cows of the left. You know, like China being capitalist, the Argentinian Trotskyists, who many around the world look to. Palestine, as so somehow the struggle is going great, or the Marxist movement has a great record on it. India, the victory, the defeat of Modi being some sort of great victory for democracy, and in France, same sound of triumphalism with the victory of the New Popular Front. And there are profound illusions in all these questions that are shackling the forces of socialism, and which have led socialists to pursue a disastrous course. And so we're sort of slaughtering the sacred cow because it's necessary to look at a reality head on. Because everywhere the forces of the socialist left, or the position of the working class, is in retreat, it is not going well for our camp. And centrally, this is because of the betrayal of the current leaders of the trade unions, who have tied the workers' movement to a wing of the bourgeoisie, and the refusal of the so-called communists to fight for a break with them and a rupture with them and a different path of struggle. And so it's necessary to take stocks of these lessons of recent struggles, to have a correct understanding of the world situation in order to orient our tasks, and to call things by their name, and not to just peddle fatuous optimism and illusions. This is what is key to really rebuild the socialist movement, but also prepare the communist vanguard for what is coming and the coming attacks that we'll see in order to emerge stronger. So, like and subscribe, get your copy of Spartacist. The articles will be linked in the description, and have a read. Get in touch with us if you like what you're reading, and or not. And yeah, like and subscribe.